You're listening to episode 193 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Ken McLeod joins us to speak about Reflections on Silver River, Tokme Zongpo's 37 Practices of a Bodhisattva. One of the difficulties we have in our modern information age is information of the overload kind. There's so much to read coming out every day, it can be difficult for us to contemplate just one more thing to digest. And sometimes we may have a tendency to set aside old works, particularly more obscure ones, simply because they are obscure. How good can it be if it's not well known? But the simple fact is there are many smaller, rare texts that speak to our contemporary life every bit as much as they did in their day, when read with the depth of attention we give poetry. The richness of these works is often overlooked in our modern-day haste, and sometimes we may want to slow down, smell the roses, and take another look. Ken McLeod is well known as a translator of texts, practices, rituals, and structures into forms suitable for this culture. He was among the first Westerners to complete the traditional 3-year retreat training in Tibetan Buddhism, and then assisted in teaching during a second 3-year retreat. Authorized to teach by the late Kalu Rinpoche, he has successfully pioneered a private practice model for teaching, made the esoteric traditions of Tibetan Buddhism practical and accessible in his book, Wake Up to Your Life, and mentored teachers from various traditions of Buddhism. He has set up a number of teacher training programs, including Passing on the Dharma in 1999 with Yvonne Rand and Ajahn Amaro. So sit back, relax, and have a nice yak butter tea. And our guest today is Ken McLeod. Ken, welcome back. Nice to speak with you again.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
So we're going to be speaking about Reflections on Silver River. And before we go into the body of the book and who wrote it and what it's about, one of the things I want to address right away is, what do you see the value of this book and these verses are for someone who's a contemporary Western secular practitioner of the Dhamma?
And there's several ways you can look at this. One is that we think that we live in a different world. And in many ways we do. We have, huge financial systems and political systems and technological systems. And we have many, many more people. But when you read any book, whether it's from Roman times or Greek times or biblical times even, you find that people in those days were dealing with exactly the same kinds of problems that we deal with in our lives. So part of the reason is that we get enchanted with this myth of progress. But progress only applies to only one portion of our lives, and in particular the accumulation of knowledge and the evolution of technology. As human beings, we don't quite evolve the same way. At least there's very little evidence that we do. And we can draw on the wisdom and experience of people who thought about these things very, very deeply, and actually, compared to our society, had far more time to think about them and see what worked and didn't work. And I want to give two examples of that. In Sumerian culture, which was an extraordinary stable society over thousands of years, much longer than anything any of us have known, they came to observe that the concentration of wealth in the society inevitably resulted in debt. And then people who got into debt ended up in slavery. And to escape slavery, they would leave the society and become brigands and raid the society from outside. So as a society, they came to appreciate that they had to do something to counteract the concentration of wealth. And what they did was to cancel debts fairly regularly. Whenever a king came to power, usually the first thing he did was to cancel all personal debts. The Jewish word jubilee comes from the tradition of canceling debts every 50 years. So that's one example of what happens when you have a society which can see things over long periods of time and learn how to work with things to provide a stability and well-being for everybody in the society. And you get similar, I won't go into more detail now, so you get the same kind of thing coming out of Sun Tzu's Art of War and Mastering the Art of War. The Chinese looked at this and looked at the very, very long-term effects of war on the society and figured out ways to counteract that. Now, unfortunately, we forget this in every generation. It has to be learned and relearned. And that's why I say progress is dubious here. But the wisdom is there, and I think there's great value going back. It's not that the tradition says this is so and you have to obey it, but if you really look at how these people thought, there are insights and ways of operating that carry years and years of experience, which I think are potentially very valuable for us.
Yeah, I would agree, because there's a tremendous insight, to use that word, in what I'm seeing in these 37 verses that then accompany a commentary that you have. But let's talk a little bit about who the original author is. What's his name? Where'd he come from? What's his story, Ken?
Jalse Muchu Tome Zongpo, that's his name. Jalse is a term, basically a synonym for bodhisattva, literally means son of the victorious one, referring to Buddha. Muchu is Silver River, and it refers to an area in eastern Tibet, which is the headwaters of the Salween River, I believe, a very beautiful area of Tibet, where Tome Zongpo lived for the latter part of his life, quietly in a hermitage when he stepped down as abbot. And his name, Tome Zongpo, Tome means no obstacle, so indestructible in that sense. And Zongpo is the word for good. And he was given this name because he was, at a very young age, he was regarded as being so brilliant that they named him after one of the greatest of the Indian logicians, the Sangha. That's why I call the book Reflections on Silver River, because it's my reflections on Tome Zongpo, one of whose names is Silver River. He lived in the 14th century, and he has become an icon of compassion in the Tibetan tradition. There are stories abound of how, even as a child, he would be taking care of animals and things in the winter. Beggars came to him in retreat. He would give them his last cup of barley or his last robe. So the beggars wouldn't go, wouldn't just stop begging for him, because they knew that he would give them anything that he had. It went so far as that, when soldiers came into the territory, when they came into his presence, they just stopped fighting. That's how powerful his presence was. So he was an orphan, basically. His parents died when he was very young. His uncle taught him to read, which is extraordinary for an ordinary Tibetan. That got him into a monastery, and that's when his intellectual gifts were recognized. And he became an abbot at a very early age. I think he was 32 or something. And after 10 years, he said, I don't want to do this. You need to find somebody more capable. And I think that's actually a model, because Uchiyama Roshi said the same thing. One shouldn't be an abbot for more than 10 years. I think that's something we should think about in the West.
Yeah, Uchiyama Roshi's Opening the Hand of Thought is one of my favorite books of the Zen tradition. He's a wonderful teacher.
Wonderful, yeah. And my favorite book is, I can't remember the name, but it used to be From the Zen Kitchen to Enlightenment. I did actually meet somebody who had met Uchiyama, And he was a very small man with a very high voice, whose voice during formal ceremonies absolutely terrified everybody who was participating in the ceremony. It was so powerful. So Tokme Zongpo stepped down as abbot and then spent the rest of his life just quietly practicing. And he wrote a few things, among them the 37 practices, which he wrote for himself, actually. It was a way of reminding himself in his practice what was important. But he wrote, I think, about 100 books, providing commentaries on various traditional texts and so forth.
So tell us a bit about the 37 practices of Bodhisattva.
The remarkable thing here is that the 37 practices follows pretty closely what in Tibetan tradition is known as Lamrim. Lamrim is a Tibetan word, and it means stages on the path, or you could say a curriculum. And this was an approach that was laid down in the 11th century by Atisha, saying these are the things you need to know. And it starts with basic motivation and refuge and relationship with your teacher and good spiritual companions, death and impermanence and appreciation of karma. Pope introduces Buddha nature into that. And then you start things like loving kindness and compassion and move on to bodhicitta and awakening mind, the 6 perfections culminating in Buddhahood and Buddha activity. And it lays out the canonical material in a way that was pretty well adhered to in the Tibetan tradition for 1,000 years. Now, there are any number of Lamrim texts. It's a whole genre of literature. Most of them run to hundreds of pages, particularly Tsongkhapa's Lamrim Chemo, which is a voluminous work. But Gampopa's The Jewel of Liberation has been translated into English, and it's a classic Lamrim text in the Kagyu tradition. What Tokme Zongpo does is he summarizes this whole way of approach in just 37 verses, which is a lot easier to read. And yet, when you really look at it, he doesn't miss much, even though it's such a drastic summary. And one of the things that I've come to appreciate in my own life is the mark of a master of a subject is that they can express the essence of a subject in very few words. And I think Tokme Zongpo is a wonderful example of that. There are ways of describing the text, but one of the ways that I use is it breaks down into 4 sections. The first section is about the fundamentals of the path. The second section is, what do you do about anger? I mean, out of 37 verses, 6 of them are very explicitly, what do you do about situations that just infuriate anyone? And then he moves into the 6 perfections, which you'll be familiar with from your Zen training. And then the last section is, how do you actually live this stuff? And it's just really practical advice. No, that's about all I need to say about that.
So let's talk for a little bit about the structure of the book itself. The verses are typically about 4 lines when they're rendered into English and Roman script. And then you have, and this is something I admire about your writing, is you start your commentary for each verse typically with a story, with either a more expanded version of what was referred to directly in the verse, like a verse about a boat, and you talk a little bit more about that, painting that picture with more lively colors, or another story that really ties it to how we may think of these things today, that if the density of the poetry in the verses is a little too packed tightly because we're used to rushing through words today instead of really sitting with them, you expand that a little bit more in your commentary. So I want to talk a little bit about the verses themselves and how a reader might approach them a little differently than we do with just standard prose text, how one might spend time with them and really savor them.
Okay, well, I think the best way to approach this, Ted, is why don't you pick a verse and let's discuss it.
Let's take a look at one. I'll do that right now. How about one that in fact, it will be one of the ones that I just mentioned, is the boat. So the verse itself is, right now you have a good boat, fully equipped and available, hard to find. To free yourself and others from the sea of samsara, day and night, constantly, study, reflect, and meditate this is the practice of a bodhisattva. And I'll just note that this is the practice of a bodhisattva that's the full stop on each verse. That's how they all end.
Yes, yeah, that's right. Okay. So what most commentaries consist of is a traditional explanation or elucidation of that. So they would take a phrase like difficult to attain and go through all the reasons why it is difficult to have a precious human existence. That's what it's about. And the 8 universal states and the 10 blessings and so forth and so forth. But I chose not to go through all of that technical stuff. And that's what you find in the Lamans, in the big text and all that stuff. And that's undoubtedly what Tokme Zongpo was referring to. But instead, because my aim here was to make this accessible to someone who comes into this with little, if any, of all of that background knowledge, then what is it? Well, I'd like to do this as a kind of conversation between the two of us, Ted, if that's okay with you.
Sure.
Okay, so was there ever a point in your spiritual practice where you find yourself standing alone and you had a choice? You could either go forward with the spiritual practice and you didn't know where it was going to take you, or you could go back to the world and forget about the whole thing.
Frequently, in fact, just yesterday again.
Okay, so that's one way of looking at this verse. And if you read my commentary on it, I think you'll see how I write it that way. Because I think this is a decision point, which, as you say, one has to face over and over again. And one of the things that I think many modern practitioners probably don't appreciate is that this practice actually changes your relationship with society, changes your relationship with people. You do not see things the same way. And you are interested in going there for a reason. Increasingly, I tend to think of it as kind of analogous to artistic expression. This is the only meaningful way that your life unfolds. And so you're going to go there, even if it costs you a lot in your life, your career, as it did mine, just a few little things like that, because it's that important to you. Another teacher of mine tells a Zen story. So this person comes to a teacher and says, I'd like to study with you. He says, come with me. And he takes him down to the river. And without any warning, he trips him up and holds his head under the water. And just before the guy's ready to expire, he lets him up, and he's just gasping for breath. And the teacher says to him, when you want to wake up as badly as you just wanted to breathe now, then come and study with me.
Yeah, there's a certain intensity in the Zen tradition.
Yeah, well, I kind of like that. And the reason saying things like that is that when you embark on this path, there really are challenges. And again, that's alluded to in this verse. That you have this boat, it's ready for you. You put a lot of preparation into it, and you need to put a lot of preparation into traveling the spiritual path because you do not know what you're going to encounter. And so there are many different dimensions, and I hope I'm giving some kind of flavor of how a person could relate to this verse.
Yeah, I think part of what comes alive in your commentary about this, because you describe a boat that's ready for you, it's all loaded and stocked up, and yet you hesitate to step into it. What is it that stops you? And you have that in the first few lines of the commentary, and that's, of course, the most important question. It's like when we're doing a meditation, what is this? That's really at the heart of the matter, and we need to explore what's there, allow it to unfold and what it means for us. And that's one of the most difficult things about teaching is there isn't a one-size-fits-all, here's the template, go away, you're done. It's very individual, and it's very specific to the context of that individual's life, and that exploration, that unfolding on its own, it's unfolding on its own for that person, and that tremendous variability of students is what makes the teaching process itself very difficult, which is one reason why we don't get very specific in, say, our guiding principles on the SBA side, or in books like this, where we don't have a giant tome that nails down every factoid of information that might be meant in these few phrases.
Well, actually, we do have those giant tomes in the Tibetan tradition.
We don't have them in my hand right now in this book, which I'm grateful for.
Well, yes. But to speak to what you just said, and this is something I've come to in myself, because I was raised in a tradition in which the path was laid out very meticulously. You did this, and then this, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's for the Lamrim, and you also had Gomrim, which means paths of meditation, et cetera. But in my own practice, I was either blessed or cursed, depending on the point of view, it didn't work for me. And I really did have to struggle very deeply and find a way forward on my own. And this has certainly influenced how I teach, because instead of teaching a path and say, well, now you do this, now you do that, etc., I present people with a set of tools, but I'm extremely aware that they're going to have to use them and fashion a path for themselves. And as the years have gone by, that approach has become more and more explicit in the way that I teach, which has both its pluses and minuses, mind you. But in the end, I think that, just as you were saying earlier, Ted, I think the path is individual. Each person wakes up in their own way, and that the role of the teacher is to provide that. And, in 1987, Shambhala published a translation that I did of Mind Training in 7 Points, under the title The Great Path of Awakening. I would dearly wish that I had chosen to translate the title as A Great Path of Awakening in order to open it up, because it makes such a difference, just that change in the article.
Yeah, it makes it tremendous as we talk about crafting a book on secular Buddhist practice, and our friend Stephen Batchelor had suggested secular Buddhist handbook, and we chatted for a few minutes about a secular Buddhist would
Yes.
be more honest and sincere about the fact that we're individuals, and how we approach the practice is going to vary, and there is no one answer that's right for everyone.
Well, again, I think it's important. This is a product of modernism, and even postmodernism, if you wish, because in earlier societies, in traditional societies, there was a far more well-defined external structure which defined your life, defined your place in life, etc. And in those contexts, what would have been the appropriate article. But in our pluralistic society, then, I think we need to take pains to respect that there are a bunch of individuals and they're going to have different paths. And so a secular Buddhist handbook or a great path of awakening, I think, is the more appropriate way to meet it in our situation.
So, Ken, in looking at the verses that are in here, and as you were working on the book itself, were there any particular verses that stood out to you as having particular meaning or value to people who might be approaching it, and understanding that there's good stuff in all of them? I've yet to found a verse I'm like, yeah, that's just kind of dopey. There's really good value in all of them. Was there any that stood out for you?
Well, yes, quite a few, actually. Verse 6, I think, is worth keeping in mind. I don't have the book in front of me right now.
I've got it. I would be happy to read it.
Please.
In fact, I was reading this just this morning. With some teachers, your shortcomings fade away and abilities grow like the waxing moon. Hold such teachers dear to you, dearer than your own body. This is the practice of a bodhisattva.
Spiritual practice is very challenging, and the role of the teacher is I see the teachers having essentially 3 roles. One is to reveal possibilities to us. And the teacher may reveal possibilities through actually teaching us or through the example of their person, what they've done, or a combination of those. The second is the teacher trains us in the methods that we actually need and the skills, and helps us develop those abilities. The third is the teacher points out where our own stuff is getting in the way, and also what we might do about that. And so those don't have to be all in the same person. You could actually have 3 different people there for those 3 things, and that was often the case, actually. But these people are very important to us in our lives, and in many respects, it is more difficult to find a teacher than it is to find a partner in life. And so if you find someone who's good and really does help you and give expression to what you're trying to give expression to, that's a very important relationship, and one needs to be take care of it, and take care of it in the sense of the way that you take care of any important relationship.
In your commentary, you say, when you do study with someone, pay attention not only to what you intend to learn, but to what you are learning. The teacher may teach you skills and train you in abilities that neither you nor he ever intended. You can't predict what actually happens.
And that's true. What I'm encouraging people to do there is to keep some intelligence, keep your feet on the ground, because many people, abrogate their own responsibility in relationship to a teacher and just put it all in the teacher's hands. And teachers don't like that. Most teachers don't like that. I mean, if they're cult leaders, they'll be very happy. But if they're solid teachers, no, they don't want to have full responsibility for your life. And so you've got to pay attention to what is actually happening to the best of your ability. I mean, none of us are perfect, but so that's why I pointed out those things. I can't pick one out here, but there's a whole series of verses, which I mentioned earlier, from 12 to 17, that are dealing with anger. I'll just read one. Even if you have done nothing wrong at all and someone still tries to take your head off, spurred by compassion, take all his or her evil into you. This is a practice in the Bodhisattva. Now, in all of these, Tokme Zongpo is appealing to taking and sending. That is, when you encounter difficult circumstances, you take in not only you open not only to your own suffering, but you imagine taking in all of the suffering of all beings and giving them your own happiness and joy and well-being. I remember I was doing a Q&A period session in Los Angeles, and someone asked me about taking and sending. So I asked her, what's something you actually love? And she loves music. She sings, and she sings in the choir, etc. I said, how often have you given your joy of singing to all sentient beings? And her face just crumpled. She had never considered it. And you think, I'm going to give away this? No, this is really important. That's precious to me. The practice is so counterintuitive. But my teacher put it beautifully one day when somebody was asking about this. He said, if you could really take away all the suffering of the world, taking it into you, so you experienced it, but everybody else was free of it in a single breath, would you hesitate to take that breath? And the answer is most of us wouldn't. Why not? That's a nice point for you.
Yeah, the interpretation of precious, because we often think of that in an unskillful way. We think of it in the one ring to rule them all, precious Gollum kind of way, where you hold it tightly to you, instead of in the very, very positive fashion, the transformative fashion to you and others, which is not just exponentially more beneficial to society as a whole when you share that kind of gift like love or compassion or something very beneficial to self and others. It helps you tremendously. And that's why the whole holding it close to you, there's an unskillful way to approach that preciousness. Preciousness in a very skillful way is a sharing of that beneficial skill or feeling tone or attitude or whatever it is that you're bringing in. Share it.
And then one other verse, which I think is really important. I think there are many in here, but could you read verse 36?
In short, everything you do, question how your mind is moment by moment. Being constantly present and aware, you bring about what helps others. This is the practice of a bodhisattva.
Now, this, I think, is an extraordinarily deep verse, because you're questioning what is happening in the mind. And this, I mean, philosophically speaking, this is pyrrhonism, or a skeptical philosophy. But you're actually living it. Like, what is happening? I'm enjoying this flower. But what else is happening? I'm forming all kinds of ideas about it. I want it. I'm going to pick it, and then nobody else can enjoy it. I mean, so, or I'm speaking the truth. Well, am I? No, it's actually I'm speaking my perception. What is the truth, etc. So this constant questioning brings a kind of awakeness and aliveness, and also an openness where things are not defined in terms of me and mine and you and yours.
Right. The selfing piece is removed from that. Yep.
Yeah. And now that we're talking about it, I may have to change the translation, but it's too late. You see, most people don't understand is the thinking process itself. The purpose of it is to induce trance so that the reactive emotions can just run. So this is why there's such importance in Buddhist practice of stepping out of the thinking practice, the thinking state. Well, just doesn't mean to say not having any thoughts. Thinking and thoughts are two different things. But you step out of this thinking, which, you have your methods with Soto Zen or Rinzai Zen using koans, and we have all kinds of methods in the Tibetan tradition. And there's this, in the beginning, just these moments of openness where there's not a lot going on. And most people panic from that because the usual references aren't there. But if you're able to stay there, then you're open to the whole situation and you will sense where the imbalance is and move in the direction of balance. And it may mean doing things that seem very, very small, but because those are the appropriate responses to the situation, they actually bring about what is helpful for everybody. So that's the point that I might try to change the translations that you bring about. It's not that you are the agent here. It's that this process of stepping out of this conceptual, explanatory thinking about the world into just being present and taking everything in creates the conditions in which something else can happen.
Yeah, the ossification of ideas, that ideation, that proliferation of mental thought, actions coming from that several layers past what is actually in the present moment can be, but I think rarely is as effective as a contemplative, deep insight into just that first layer of what's actually happening here, rather than ideas about it.
I'm not sure it's really the first layer. You step out of all of the usual frames of reference, and that allows you to see things in other ways. I mean, in my work as a business consultant, that was my primary value to my clients, is that I would ask these completely off the wall, really dumb questions. But it's because I was operating outside of their usual frame of reference. That's why I could even think of the dumb questions, because those questions were so stupid, they wouldn't have even paid attention to them. And that caused them to think about situations in different ways. And when they did, then they often saw far more effective solutions or different ways of doing things than they would have within their ordinary frame of reference.
Yeah, it's having a different perspective than we would otherwise have, because we all have our frameworks. We all have our goggles on of some kind, and they're polychromatic goggles. They're constantly changing and moving moment by moment. And it is very challenging for us to see outside that.
And I'd like to comment on that. It is extremely challenging. I mean, I imagine you've read Brian Victoria's Zen at War,
mm-hmm.
in which he talks about how these pillars of the Zen community absolutely supported the Japanese war effort. And we had the same kind of, including the rape of Nanking and all of that stuff. But you had the same problem in our society, in the Crusades, for instance. And we still have it, with God on our side and so forth, where you feel that you are expressing God's will in waging war, or you're the instrument of karma in the case of the Japanese in World War II. This, of course, is utter nonsense. And it raised for me the question, what is the quality which allows you to see through the inequities and the suffering of your own culture? And it's not insight, it's compassion. Because compassion puts you in touch with suffering wherever it is, regardless of how it comes about. And what people would regard, this is just a natural order of things, or this is just the way we do things. You see, no, somebody is in pain here. Whether it's a woman struggling with a child or any of the different forms of discrimination, you name it, one sees the actual pain and relates to that. And I had I used to be on the AIDS Interfaith Council in Los Angeles back in the late 80s. The AIDS Interfaith Council consisted largely of Episcopalian, Methodist, Baptist, and Jewish clergy. But then there were a few odd ducks like me representing the Buddhists. I think there was someone from the Hindu community. But one of the people there was a fundamentalist minister from Orange County. And she was amazing because she knew she was in liberal territory and she was fearless. And she would just say to these people, look, you want the support of our people? do not try to change their beliefs about homosexuality or different lifestyles or anything like that. They will just close the doors in your face. But if you tell them about how people are suffering, they will open their doors and pour out their support. And I just watched her and said, wow, boy, she gets it. And so here was someone who really understood how the principle of compassion and how it cuts through all the belief systems.
You know, it's interesting that as each verse, as we mentioned, ends with, this is the practice of a bodhisattva. In your introduction, you talk about compassion and really what that means. And you summarize it quite well, that is, a bodhisattva lives and breathes compassion, as you're saying.
I have to say, that's a phrase from one of my students.
It's a good one, nonetheless. So the book we've been talking about is Reflections on Silver River. Our guest today, Ken McLeod. You can find out more about what Ken is doing on his site, unfetteredmind.org. Ken, thanks for being here.
It's been a pleasure. I always enjoy our conversations.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizan Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are also linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.